Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. I can't introduce my next guest without being honest about how hard introducing her has been to write. How do you encapsulate almost 50 years of art and metal and over 30 years in art knife making? How do you truly put into words the magic that she's created in her work and the mythic proportion her life energy has produced? How do you describe magic, or better yet, the expression of one's soul through their life and work? There may not be a single word to describe all of the things that she does or has done, but there is a singular word that tells you who she is, and that's Dellana. Dellana, it's an honor to have you on the Good Old Blades podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, well, it's an extreme pleasure. I would consider you, in the grand scheme of what I've been trying to do with the podcast, a white whale of sorts. I've there's like I've had Steve Johnson and Bruce Bump and a few other really great, like leaders and legendary knife makers in the industry and everything on and talk to them. And I've always, since before I actually started the podcast, always wanted to be able to have you on and talk to you and really get in depth with your knife making career, but just kind of what spawns and your like the creativity and the objective lens that you look at art. And so, a long time coming. I really appreciate you investing the time and sitting with me and talking, and especially for my listeners, because I would say probably almost indiscriminately, everybody I've ever talked to loves you, and loves your work and everything. So,
oh, that's very nice to hear. Thanks for telling me that.
Yeah. So, there's kind of this weird conundrum that we have in the industry where a lot of people don't know the giants that we're resting on the shoulders of. And because of that, I'd like I think I would like for you to give a brief introduction of yourself, just for the idiots in the room, like myself being included, but just so everybody knows, kind of like a 30,000 foot view of who you are, kind of what you've done in the industry through your eyes and everything, and that way we can get past the introduction component and really talk more about all the things that I want to talk about versus just people understanding who you are and what you have been doing in the industry for as long as you have, if that works for you.
Sure. Well, I've been a full-time maker. I went full-time in 1995. I had started learning from Jim Schmidt in 1993. But before that, I had been a full-time goldsmith and art jeweler for 17 years. I went to art school at Skidmore College and really focused on jewelry then. Loved metal, just absolutely adored working with metal. And I had the opportunity at a museum craft organization that I was a part of. I had the opportunity to meet Jim Schmidt. And when I saw his work, it just blew my mind. I absolutely adored his knives, and I loved folding knives. And it turned out he didn't live very far away from me. And long story short, at one point, I ended up going to his shop. I had an ex-boyfriend at that time that thought he might like to make knives. I remembered Jim, and I said, well, I can ask him if he would talk to you. And we ended up going up to Jim's shop, and he was very gracious, and he was going to be forging some steel. So he had made up a couple extra billets so that my ex-boyfriend and I could try it. And I tried it, and I absolutely loved it. It was instantaneous, just a magical experience that I absolutely adored. And wanted to do forever. And the boyfriend was incapable of doing it, and he was afraid of the forge and afraid of the hammer and everything else. So that was gone after that. But I'm grateful that because of him, I got to find this magical thing that I love to do so much. And I had no clue who Jim was in the grand scheme of things, none whatsoever, because he was a very unassuming man of few words. He did not suffer fools gladly. I didn't know any of this about him other than that he was a man of few words at the time. He was just someone that lived near me that would let me come and play in his shop, and he taught me how to make folding knife mechanisms, because that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to make folding knives. And that was my first knife, was a folding knife. And he said, well, you might want to go down to the New York Custom Knife Show and see that. And so went down and looked at that, and I was just blown away by all these knife makers and all of this. And I just loved the idea of being able to forge the Damascus steel and then use my skills as an artist and a goldsmith to add precious metals, which I also love, and gemstones into the whole artistic vision that I would have for each piece. And it turns out that I did. And he enjoyed working with me because I already had metalsmith knowledge. I was an experienced metalsmith. One of the main things that was helpful was that I knew how to finish things well, and I understood certain concepts about working with metal and things like that he didn't have to take me from day one with no knowledge. And so I think it was fun for him to have somebody like that was very eager to learn everything, but could take it away and do it on my own in my own shop, or studio is what I called it at the time, and then go back and show him what I had done. So that's kind of a really short version of how I got to where I am.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine, something that I think about with teaching is, especially in a craft, there is an awful lot of energy that goes into passing knowledge from one mind to another, right?
Tremendous amount of energy.
Yeah. And I think that one of the conundrums with being a teacher is whether that energy is well spent. And I love the collaboration and the knowledge sharing that goes on inside of the knife industry today. But I think the same way that the younger generation considers knowledge and information as being a given, especially because of the internet and all of these
right.
modalities that we have for education, that we kind of take that for granted. So, you have Bill Ruppel or something like that who will spend an awful lot of time answering questions over and over and over again for people who just want to learn from the master. And none of those, maybe a very, very, very small percentage takes that knowledge and does something with it. And even fewer still take that knowledge, do something with it, and create something that is unique and is interesting, I guess. I always look for interesting people when I try to educate, that want to take this to a different level, like see the world in a way that I don't see it. And I can imagine that Jim saw you the same way.
I think he did. And one of my very strong feelings at the time when I started working with him is that I already had I knew how to express myself and my ideas on my own without copying someone else. And it was very important to me when I came into this that my work did not look like his at all, other than the quality. I would emulate his quality, but I did not want people to say, oh, that's one of Jim Schmidt's type of knives, because I saw a lot of those type of knives. And I just did not want to do that. I had my own ideas I was going to do that. So I did that immediately. I just started doing my own designs and working from my own voice. And I think he really enjoyed seeing what I would come up with too. And I want to go back here to what you were saying about about learning and how easy it is to find information now. Because when I started as a jeweler back in the 70s, of course, there was no internet. That wasn't even thought of as far as I know. And the jewelry industry was very closed. There was not a lot of information given. There was not a lot of help available out there. I went to art school, which is an entirely different situation from learning technical skills from other jewelers. And it's a much more closed off, fearful industry than the knife world was. When I came into the knife world, I was amazed at the generosity of information that was freely given with a great attitude. I was really amazed at that. But when I first started, I actually made my first knife in 1978. I made a little slip joint folder. I found the process in a book called the Penland School of Craft book. It was the first one. People may know the second edition of it, which is an entirely different book with entirely different projects in it. But all I had were some photographs of knife parts on a piece of graph paper. And I followed the instructions from that. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have the tools to work with steel at all. But the process took you through annealing an old file, cutting the blade out, and then creating this slip joint mechanism. And I was immensely proud of this when I finished it. I was a young military wife at that time. And my ex-husband was stationed in Pearl Harbor, and he had gone out to sea, and I didn't know anybody, and I didn't have access to anybody that could tell me anything about how to do this. I would go over to Hickam Air Force Base and use their machine shop to to drill my pivot hole and my handle holes, and not one guy in there would talk to me because I was a complete oddity in 1978 being over there. They never saw a female in that shop, and I didn't know what I was doing. I must have broken 12 drill bits trying to do what I was doing. But I managed to do it. But there was no source of information for me to go to at all. And it's so entirely different now that perspective is really such an interesting thing. It makes you appreciate. I mean, I see people giving away information and just throwing out all of this information. And it's like, wow, it's so amazing to be able to find out the answer to any question you have just by typing it onto a keyboard. It's just amazing to me.
Yeah, but conversely, it is sometimes a little bit annoying too. And I say this in the sense that everything before the proliferation of information was really considered trade secret, right? Mm-hmm. The masters would toil over learning this stuff, and it felt like you had earned a seat at the table if you could figure out a way to do this stuff where you didn't have to ask anybody, that you ideated, right? And there are certain things that to me are like givens in knives. Like, if you want to do a good hand rub satin finish or something like that, or you want to do a very basic low layer Damascus or something, right? It's pretty straightforward now, or it's common knowledge. But then there are other things that are technique or nuances that are hard earned. Like, how did you do this specific thing? How did you do a keyway bolster, or finish something out in hide pins, like frame knives, or how did you do certain things inside of pocket knives? And I think that there's a little bit of a fiduciary duty that we have as knife makers when we're learning things from people, to understand what is freely given and free, like common knowledge to get us up to par, and what is like rented knowledge, I guess I could say. Like for instance, your Dellana dots system on your knives is something that is very widely copied by knife makers, but it is, but very seldom attributed to you as the maker who started doing that. And that's something that is a little bit frustrating in some ways. And I've talked to Steve Schwarzer about this. Is, when you learn something, you do have a responsibility in some way to carry on the legacy of that knowledge, the provenance of that for the people who have taught you. And it's something that kind of gets slighted a little bit more in the industry than I'd like to see.
It does. It does. And when I first did that, invented them, because I had to, because I had an issue that I had to fix, that was the only solution I could come up with. When people saw them, it was new, and it worked so well that they, wanted to use them. I understand that completely. And that thrilled me. And as a matter of fact, Jim Schmidt, because I asked him before I actually did it, because I hadn't seen anybody do anything like it. And I was concerned that, maybe it was like an unspoken no-no that you didn't put anything on or through the blade like that. And he looked at him and he said, quietly, because I went and showed him the knife. The problem was that I had not anticipated that the thickness of the scales, if the blade sat in that far, it was going to be hard to open it, to grab a hold of it and open it. And it was my second knife, and I didn't know what to think, to look ahead, the problems and things that you learn to think about. So I couldn't get this blade open without a lot of pain in the neckness involved. And I hate a nail nick. Hate them. I think they're ugly, and they are functionally very difficult to use. And a nail nick would not have gone with the design that I was doing, and I wasn't going to even do that. So I thought of something else, and I took my problem to Jim, said, this is what I'm thinking of doing. Is this something that would be frowned upon? And he was looking at the knife, and he looked at me, and he was a man of few words, and he was quiet for a minute, and I thinking, oh dear, he's just trying to be polite. And he looked at me and he said, that's a great idea, and I'm going to use it. Or actually, he said, I'm going to steal it, but I'll call them Dellana dots. And that's how the name came to be. And that was such a thrill for me, that he thought my idea was good enough to do. And he always called them Dellana dots. And I had a lot of knife makers that wanted to do them, that did ask me if I minded. And of course I didn't mind. I was thrilled that people thought it was a good idea. I just finished writing an article for Blade Magazine about how and why I invented Dellana dots, and also how I make them. And I don't use a lathe when I make mine, because I didn't have a lathe. That wasn't in my mental vocabulary to think in terms of using a lathe. So when I invented them, I made them a different way. And I've detailed in the article exactly how I do that. And I haven't left anything out. And I've given some information that most people that don't have my background might not think of to do. So I hope it's helpful.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of reminded in the process of making, your knives entirely. Your dot system it usually uses precious metals, right? Those are gold typically.
Always 14 karat or 18 karat. Yeah.
Yeah. As a knife maker who's invested in materials and things like that, I've always noticed that there's kind of like this quandary where when when you're adding certain type of materials in, that it increases the cost of a knife and thus kind of changes the market and everything on who will buy it. With you starting off using precious metals and precious stones and everything as part of your art expression, has that ever limited the audience or the market that you can then sell your knives because of what you've chosen as your medium?
Yeah, absolutely. I the first knife I sold was in 1990. I think it was 94, and I sold it for $1,200, which was a lot for a brand new maker. And there was a bit of resentment about that fact, but I think that people didn't understand. First of all, I'm using precious metals. I started then all the pins in my knives are 14 karat. That big thick 1/8 pivot pin is pretty pricey, just in materials alone.
Yeah.
And but the collectors that saw it, that wanted it, and that were in that price bracket were delighted to see something different. It wasn't that they're buying gold, they're buying my ideas, which are different, which is really what set me apart. And I think there's two things that set people apart in when you're making things by hand. And one is design and the other is finish. And if you can combine those two things, if your design is unique, you and appealing, I think that the buyers will find you. As I said, I had already been a goldsmith for 17 years. I was actually an art jeweler. I didn't work in a jewelry store. I didn't own a jewelry store. I didn't want to be tied down to a retail store situation. I sold in galleries across the country, including one on Fifth Avenue in New York. And so I knew how to price. I knew what my clientele for my jewelry thought in terms of pricing and value and price points. So I wasn't intimidated by that. When I started with the knives, I just thought, I'll put this out here. I love to do it and see what happens. I wanted to do it. I wanted to do it full time, but I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't feeling like I was getting paid enough to do it either. Because I already had another business with a market that I could do. Knives take so much longer than jewelry, particularly folding knives. They just take forever, particularly when you get into the detail stuff that I do, that I like to do. I definitely had a boost up the ladder by knowing Jim Schmidt, because he had a great number of collector friends and he was absolutely so sought after. And because he would introduce me to those people, I am so grateful for the opportunity. I've never not been grateful for it. And when I started to realize exactly who he was in the knife world, it was just one of those feelings of being so fortunate to have had this opportunity, because I was able to start where if I didn't have that and I wasn't seen and I wasn't introduced to collectors that could afford my work and wanted my work, it would have been a lot harder. And I am not unaware of that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's something that with the proliferation of knowledge and everything, there's also a weird paradigm that I've noticed where sometimes it's a little bit harder now to get the nod from certain premier makers or whatever than it seems like maybe it used to be. And it could be a totally, anecdotal observation, but I I've been able to work with a few really great makers, but it seems like by and large, when you get to a certain echelon of making and you have a certain customer list and everything like that, that's really very protected, because that's your that's who you sell your own work to, and then to introduce a protege or whatever into that same market means that you do have some level of competition, as it were, for the dollars that those collectors have. And so I've noticed at least that, getting validated by a maker that is, has a good reputation and everything is a little bit, is a little difficult, especially as somebody who's, I've been in it, 7-8 years now. Getting a nod is kind of a tough thing to do.
Well, it's, again, I think with the proliferation and the ease of getting in touch with people now, anybody can go online and pretty much talk to anybody now. And, if you're on Facebook or Instagram, you can comment on their stuff. So there's this, it's not as hard, and it doesn't take a tenth of the effort that it used to take to talk to somebody in that echelon. And so I think sometimes it's, how do I want to put this? That the new makers don't understand the value of the person that they're talking to. Does that, not the value of the person, but of the knowledge that person has? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, it's respect, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's really kind of
that's
what it is,
it.
right? I mean, we don't, like, new makers don't respect the hard-earned knowledge, the connections, and everything. They take that for granted, and they walk into it saying, "Okay, let me give me your entire Rolodex," and you're like, do you even know what a Rolodex is? Like it's
right.
Like I've had to culminate all of these entries one by one, and all of those represent like an entire relationship that you have no concept of, and you just want to give it to me, kind of like it's some sales book or whatever. It's like, calm down, youngin.
Right, exactly. I mean, I remember like maybe the second year I was making knives, and I'd already been mentioned in Blade magazine, so this, people were starting to hear my name, and my knives were being pictured in there and stuff like that. And I had one guy contact me that wanted like a $400 knife, and I said, now when I say contact, of course, this was not online somewhere where he just typed it in and sent me a message. He sent me a letter, and he wanted a knife, and I wrote him back. I mean, this concept is so bizarre to people these days that somebody would have to write you a letter, because I wasn't real free with my phone number at that time either. But he wrote me a letter, and he wanted a knife, and I wrote him back, and I said, "I'm sorry, but I don't make any knives in that price range," because I was already busy. I was still making jewelry at that point, and then just transitioning over into being a full-time knife maker. And I had I'm starting to get people that are waiting for my knives and stuff, and I just said no, I couldn't do it. And he was very angry with me, and he wrote me back, and he said, I mean, he really told me how horribly thought it was that I wouldn't make a knife in his price range. And it was just so, it didn't bother me, because I just realized that he did not understand my perspective and what I was talking about. I wasn't meaning to be, arrogant or anything. It's just, this is a business decision. I just couldn't do it. And but that interaction has always stuck in my mind. And I think the temptation can be for new makers that you got to take everything that comes along. And I had already been through that phase as a young jeweler, that I didn't know how to price, and I didn't know how to handle my own feelings about prices, because it's very difficult to get over that. Well, I can't afford this thing that I make, and it's really hard to ask somebody else to pay for it.
Yeah.
If that makes any
Well,
sense.
yeah. I mean, I encounter that a lot with my own work, and it has a lot to do with the fact that I know the value of my time when it relates to what my primary vocation is, which is cybersecurity and technology, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
I've spent a long time cutting my teeth to gain the knowledge that I have and everything, and so I expect that carries a certain dollar amount, either per hour or salary or whatever. And so over
Sure.
the years, I've gotten to a place where I feel like I deserve to be well paid for the level of effort and the knowledge that I bring to the table. But in knives as a part-time vocation, I sometimes I don't feel that way. It's sometimes, I think that I have a problem giving myself the permission to charge what I feel my value is, even though the industry in some ways does not qualify new makers at that tier of pricing. And but that's I think a personal thing that everybody has to struggle with and gain confidence over. And one of my things has been, well, if I want the dollar amount to be what it is, then I got to put forth the effort to resolve the fact that my piece is priced the way that it is. You know what I mean? Like you can't have shoddy work. You can't have non-symmetrical grinds. Like your fit and finish has to be on par with what you're going to be asking for, and that's kind of where I start and stop with the perceived value, because I mean, we all know, like, the amount of time that we have in these knives, and in the materials and things like that we use. Break even is a really hard concept when you start removing just the raw cost
Yeah.
of material, and then you talk about your life energy and how how many other things you're sacrificing in order to make this thing for somebody else who just wants to put a dollar figure on it.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's that is a constant struggle. The pricing is a constant struggle in terms of I know how to price things. I know how to set those down. I know the formulas. I have been doing this a long time. I don't have not had another job since I was in high school, and I've been an artist. This is what I do. And it's very difficult sometimes to wear that business hat that says, this is how much you need to charge for that. If you're in business and you have to make a profit if you want to stay in business, so that you can buy that other tool or take another class or do whatever. And that is a really, really difficult thing to deal with. The psychological aspect of that can be really hard, and it's still not easy for me. I don't know if I doubt it ever will be, but it's an overriding of the my own mental discomfort about that number.
Yeah. Well,
And one thing I see, I I'm still interested in jewelry, because I do just love precious metals and working with those. I do the occasional piece of jewelry if somebody really wants something that's going to be fun to do. And I am in some jewelry groups on Facebook, and it's always interesting to me to watch the young makers who they can't. I mean, they're using precious metals, but they're practically giving them pieces away because they're not charging a, a correct pricing structure for their work, and it hurts them and it hurts the industry. And yet I understand it completely because it's very, very difficult. One thing I had to come to in my mind was the understanding that there is a market for every single price point out there, from the least expensive to the most expensive. It's kind of pyramid shaped because if you're going to do the most expensive, there are fewer buyers at that price point, but they are there. And yeah, it's for me, it's always been an understanding that that's just another hat to wear if you're going to be an artist. If you don't have a manager, if you don't have somebody else to say what you should charge or make your sales for you, you're going to have to do it yourself. And if you can kind of view it as another art form, it can become a little more comfortable that way.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I mean, it's also how many $1 million ideas are out there, right? And if you have $1 million idea, you might be able to make $1 million at it. But if you're just being derivative and have a $500 idea, well, then that's what you're going to get. And I think that there is that creative paradigm where people want. I attribute it kind of like that. So we have an 8.5-year-old, and she comes to me and she draws a picture, or she, I don't know, hops on one foot or whatever and says, "Hey, Dad, look at this." It's like, "This is super cool." And I'm like, the first time I see it, it's like, that's pretty great. You've learned some new skill or whatever. And the second time she comes and she wants to get the same response, I'm like, "Nah, you can do better." Like you've already reached this idea or echelon, right? Like you can do a little bit better. Like push yourself to do something different and intrigue me. You want the accolades of admonishment and everything. Do something a little bit different. And I like that is the same with the development of ideas and the development of I guess like a personal bar, like setting a bar of achievement, is that if you want admonishment for something that is out of the box thinking, you have to first think out of the box, and you have to understand what it means to push beyond the creative boundaries of what everybody else is doing and into something that is exploratory.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's where you get paid. Well, because like with your knives, I look at them and I constantly sit here and wonder what gave you this idea to do this thing in this way, right? I look at your work and I'm constantly fascinated with where the inspiration comes from, and then a layer beyond that, how you technically executed it, and then maybe I wonder, hey, is there ways to incorporate that kind of conceptualization or whatever into my own work? But then I go back to, I don't know if I necessarily am that smart. I don't have, super creative ideas like that in some ways. And like you just think so far outside the box that like your knives are $1 million ideas, and people who have that money are willing to exchange their dollar widgets for the ability to sit here and hold this thing and admire it and collect it, because what they are holding is two things. One is your mind in the ideation that it takes to create that thing, and the other is your life energy, because it took you time, finite time, to make it and to bring that to the world, right? And to me, there's really no good way to price that, because how do you price somebody's soul or life energy or whatever?
Right.
And that's always the conundrum.
Well, two things here. First of all, I view money as a form of energy, and it kind of takes away some of the intimidation factor of the having to earn the money. It's just a form of energy. In terms of the ideas, I was very fortunate to grow up with a mother who was an artist. She was a graphic artist. She worked in advertising. She was very creative in pretty much all areas. And she was very interested in encouraging my sister and I to be creative in whatever way we wanted to be creative. She made sure we went to whatever classes we had any interest in. She hated to sew, but she saw that my sister and I liked the idea of it, so we went to singer sewing for sewing classes, and all of this during late childhood and teenage years. So I had this idea that you could make things, you could make anything you wanted to. Basically, it was just learn how to make that thing, and then your ideas, you could make whatever your ideas were. When I ended up in college with in the metals program, I was very fortunate again to have my professor was Earl Pardon, who was an extremely important studio jeweler in the middle of the last century. He was fantastic, and I loved his work, and he thought out of the box. But for some reason, the way he taught how to design just clicked with me, and I was able to get the feeling of how you do that, because and this is going to start sounding a little weird, but there is a feeling that goes along with doing anything well. And when an athlete practices and finally gets to a level of competency where they're really, really, really good or the best at what they do, that's because they have learned to be able to repeat the feeling of that act being perfectly done, resulting in whatever the end result, the best possible end result is supposed to be. So I look for that feeling involved, or vibration, if you want to call it that, of doing that thing or that idea at the highest level. Does that make any sense? Is that too out there?
Oh no. I mean, I'm picking up what you're throwing down. I mean, for me, like the esoteric nature of things is something that is very familiar. Like I'm always, I don't know why. Like maybe if I think back to like when I was a kid and everything, I've always been a little bit, I guess, like thinking on the spectrum, as it were. Mm-hmm. I can remember going out as a kid, and we grew up in the late 80s. Or I was born in the late 80s, but in rural Appalachia in Pennsylvania, where we were from, we were a few things. We were poor. We were not really well educated. If you want to like fix tractors or know how to raise cows or things like that, like rural intelligence, mm-hmm. Like salt of the earth people, right? But my mom would like kick us out and say, "Hey, go play outside" or whatever, and I would sit there and like look at leaves and wonder why the leaves had veins on them, right? I mean, I was like 6 years old or whatever. And, I always, as I think about the way that my mind has worked from a very early age, I've always wondered, what is the thing behind the thing, right? So like being able to look at the layers below the surface and understand like the causal chain and everything. And so the concept of esotericism and spirituality and what makes magic, right? Those are all interesting to me, and I think like in general, the listenership of the podcast is that way too. They come here to kind of get a little bit more beyond the surface of knives. So I totally understand that, and I don't think it's kooky either, because a lot of us experience these things in some ways, but I think that there's also not a lot of articulation around like naming things. Like you and Van are big on vibrations and energy and things like that. And to me, that is a perfect representation of it, because there's this big question mark around what causes us to create things and what causes us to go down a certain path or follow our gut or live in this zone of passion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we are all using maybe different terminology in some ways to try to articulate that same kind of feeling, if all that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense. And I had an interesting thing happen one time, and it brought me to the conclusion that where do our ideas come from? Where does this perfect idea that you had no idea of before it popped in your head come from? And as I was saying about my jewelry professor, Earl Pardon, and him being able to impart how to pull these ideas onto a piece of paper, there was a feeling once I got that idea of how to do that. And that's really all it was, because there was no big long process of figuring out how to do this. It was just like all of a sudden, and luckily I happened to tap into that feeling, and then I was able to repeat it. But the experience that I had that made me really come to the conclusion that I did was that this was after about probably 10, 12 years of doing this. And you didn't have this enormous input of ideas that you get if you're on your phone or your computer or whatever that is blasted at you every single day. And I think it's really much more difficult to come up with a unique idea if your brain is constantly seeing a zillion ideas that are not your own. And this was back in probably, it was around 1985. And I always kept a sketchbook of my jewelry ideas, and I just would sketch. And, when you sketch a lot, every idea is not a good idea, but you get to cross those out that aren't, and it might help you to go to the next one that is a good idea or a worthwhile idea to put any energy into. And I was very prolific with my drawings, and I couldn't turn out nearly as much as I drew. Just time-wise, it wasn't possible. But I would have them that I could go back to and think I wanted to do that. And I had a really good idea, and I don't even remember what it was right now. It's in the notebook somewhere. And I thought, I'm going to go back to that one because I really liked it a lot. And it was different. Nobody else out there was doing it. And of course, the only reason I know nobody else out there was doing it was because once a month I might get a jewelry magazine that showed ideas, other people's ideas out there. That's the only input you had in those days. There wasn't a lot you could find a book every now and then. You could find good magazines every now and then, but they were not an everyday, anytime you wanted incoming thing like the internet is. And I had that idea in my notebook. And I'm thinking, I'm going to do that. I'm trying to decide when I'm going to have the time to do this. But it was going to be within the next several months. And the next magazine I got the next month, this guy, it was like he stole my idea out of my notebook because it was right there. And I remember looking at that going, man, there is no possible way he could have seen I had no idea who he was. I didn't know him. He was another jeweler from some other part of the country. It just happened to have this picture in this magazine, and it was my exact idea. And I just remember kind of giggling to myself thinking, these ideas must be just out there in the ether, and somehow we manage to be open enough to have them, grab them out of there in our mind, with our mind, as they're floating by or something, because there was no way, no possible way. Nobody ever saw my notebook. I didn't share my notebooks, and there was no possible way somebody else could have done the exact same idea that I had. So I really think our best ideas are the ones that just pop in and go, oh, that's a great idea. And you just start exploring that. I think there is a level a level of vibration where these things come out of. Once you get that basic idea, then you can put your own spin on it, and you can develop it, and you can do variations of it and all that kind of thing. And that's much more hands-on and, paper to pencil kind of thing than that initial idea, that initial idea.
Yeah. Well, something I think I kind of put that concept of vibration and ether and ideas and stuff like that in spirituality, right? And I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable here for a second. When my daughter was going through her heart transplant experience and everything, it wasn't just a journey that she was going through; it was a journey through that all of us were going through. And
of course.
And we're religious. We're Christian and everything. And I can remember. Being so scared that she would die, and just everything, like pleading, begging the universe, God, whatever, to like make this thing work, right? And to give me like my heart wanted just one thing, and it was like to have another day with my kid. And
sure.
And we've been so blessed that she had a heart transplant, that she's gotten through everything, and then she's in the other room right now, and she's doing schoolwork stuff, and we'll watch videos and movies and stuff like that, and we'll listen to music and stuff, and it's been a pleasure to have her around. Like, my life is completely different having her in my life. But on the opposite side of that experience, my stepson, right before Evelyn got out of the hospital, died in a motorcycle accident.
Wow.
And I've really struggled over the years trying to understand why. That on one side of this coin, Evelyn is doing well, and we've just, it's just been it's unignorable, the miracle that is her just walking around. Because if you would have seen it from my eyes or the doctor's eyes, she's just a walking, living miracle. But then I also juxtapose that with losing Christian and the devastation it's caused in our lives. It's like this yin and yang of life and suffering and birth and loss and all this stuff. And I think there's the traditional Christian worldview of things doesn't really explain that well enough. And so I've delved a little bit more into mindfulness and some of the stuff that is more widely embraced with I guess Hindu spirituality or Buddhism or whatever. And what I've thought about a lot is that, like, us as like celestial beings, us as spiritual beings, we feel things in the tangible plane of what we manipulate in our bodies and everything. And I know it gets a little kooky, right? But I think you'll understand this. But it's like we have our experiences, we have our life, and it's birth to grave, right? But then there's the what's after that. And I've spent a lot of time in the what's after that because I've had this living experience of like miraculous like regeneration and everything with Evelyn, and then I've also felt this loss with Christian, and at the same time I have the elation of life. I also have the tragedy of death, and I wonder like what his experience is now, right? Because I don't think that we just die and it's lights off and we don't we don't
Right.
do anything, right? I mean, both from a religious perspective, but then also I feel something that's different than just lights off and Christian is no longer there, doesn't exist in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
And I think that we're like as human beings or whatever, we are a filter for electricity and energy, right? That we experience it in this focal plane, but there's really like, dimensionality and everything beyond that we just don't understand. And I think about that too with ideas and with feelings and with putting out good vibes or karma or whatever. Everybody has these different terms and words to try to describe it. The same way as we're trying to describe these things in knives in this medium, I think that we also extend out and are trying to understand that in life. And so I've had lots of ideas that it's so odd. It's so odd that somebody else would be picking up on those same things. And I guess that's where some people are like, there's no original thought. But I don't really know if that's I think there's just thought. I think there's just things that exist out there, right? And it's up to us to take that thing and somehow hold it and to manipulate it and to look at how we see it, and then that objective lens bring it to existence in our own way. Because there's the difference between you and me is not that we're both human. It is that the constant is that we live in a universe that is pretty predictable. And I say that in a weird way because it's not. It's like chaos, right? But
Yeah.
what makes I think what makes you and I different is that we can take the same energy that we live in and manipulate it in a completely different way because your spirit's different than my spirit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. This whole topic is something that I've been very, very interested in since I was late teenager, early 20s. What we can do with our mind and what does all of it all mean, and all, the reason and why and all of that. I I'm trying to formulate the thought here because a lot of these, when you get into this topic, there's a lot of limitation in words.
No, I totally get you.
Yeah. I've it's my thoughts are racing here. You don't have to include this. My thoughts are starting to race here because I love this topic. And there is so much involved with it. I'm just trying to find a place to start.
Well, isn't it cool to just be able to experience that and to be in a medium where you can be passionate about this kind of idea? Like I like actually talking about stuff like this because it is like that undiscovered and unexplored region of human experience that there's very few that really are kind of interested in delving in it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and yet it's our essence.
Funnily enough, yeah.
Yeah. I got interested in it because I was interested in what our minds could do, like the idea of miracles and things like that. And I was just interested, and I remember one of the first books I read was this just little paperback book on self-hypnosis, and that fascinated me. And I had and I remember in there it had talked about something about relieving pain. Like if you had a pain, you could control it with your mind. And I was just, that was such a novel idea. And I loved that whole idea that you could do that, that you had that kind of control, that you could do that. And I had a chance to try it out not long after I read about it. I had been hiking and hurt my knee, just long story short, hurt my knee, and got back to the house, and my knee was all swelled up. It was red, and it was very, very painful. And I was, as I continue to be, I was always reluctant to go to the doctor for stuff. It just seemed like, waste of time, and I don't really want to do that. So I remember it was hurting bad enough that I was actually thinking, I might need to go to the emergency room. And I thought, well, I'm going to just, my ex-husband and I were watching TV, and I thought, we were watching a movie, and I thought to myself, well, I'm just going to try to do that thing I read about in the book till the end of the movie. And then if it's still as bad as it is now, I'll think about going to the hospital for it. And by the time, and the perfect thing of being in that trance type state that happens when you're watching movies and television and things like that, very suggestible state. I did what the book had said, and by the time the movie was done, the swelling had gone down and the pain was gone. And this just blew me away. I was just in amazement, because it was definitely hurt before that. There was definitely a problem. And yet it was gone completely. And I was just flabbergasted by that. And I thought, well, I'll see how it is in the morning. And it was gone. There was no residual, no pain, no nothing. And I had come down off of a ledge into a pile of leaves, and I didn't realize there was a rock, small boulder thing there, and it jammed my knee up into my upper leg there, and it was just a nasty thing to have done to it. And I was just so amazed that this thing had proven itself to me to be what I had read about worked. So that's what really started me off into looking into what the power of our minds are, and how that works and what that can do. And that led me to working with an old woman who was a hands-on healer, very skillful at it and very deliberate at it, understood how to manipulate the vibrations of things and work within that framework and everything. And that was, it's been a recurring interest for me my whole life. I've delved into it, and the things I've learned have been pretty amazing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, something that I'm currently not looking into, but testing out is these concepts of like earthing or grounding, right? Mm-hmm. And it makes, I guess, like, it makes a lot of sense to me, because like science kind of understands from an objective lens, or tries to explain things that happen naturally that I don't know, that like they're like phenomena or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And to do it in a repeatable way, so that way we understand what the underlying mechanisms are. But I have always been a nature boy, as it were. I mean, like, as it's standard hillbilly mentality of being out in nature, and with no shoes on, and just like clicking around, all that stuff, right?
Yep.
And I spent like the majority of my life just being out and connecting with nature in a way. I mean, I used to go fishing. I'd go out walking and hiking everywhere and stuff like that. And I would say like in my early 30s, it was like after Evelyn was born, I pretty much removed myself from nature, because the requirement was, you're going to be in the hospital. We're going to do these things. You have a child to nurture and everything. And I think that that's where a lot of like my malady started. I mean, I've had type 1 diabetes for forever, but I've
Oh dear.
noticed, yeah, I've had it since I was 16. And, uh, I just noticed that I started to feel old. I like my body hurt more. I like it was harder to recover from being sick. I just felt sick. And there's some of the science around grounding is that, well, we're evolved or whatever to be part of nature and to benefit symbiotically from its energy, right? And like you cut yourself off from that and you disconnect from that Earth's energy or whatever, and there's sickness and other things that occur because of that, inflammation and whatnot. And so this kind of
Yes.
idea of grounding yourself and balancing out ions and whatnot is interesting to me. And it's I can't really say that it's like I've noticed a humongous difference. It's not like miraculous like some people who have experienced, but the science behind it makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of published studies now about it. The same way as like acupuncture used to be kind of kooky, but
Right.
now everybody's like, oh yeah, there's energy meridians and other things like that that you can tap into and whatnot, and our body just channels all of that. Like okay, like I don't think it's as weird as some people might think, but like nobody looks at stuff like that oddly when you're just out, walking on the beach or
Right.
putting your feet in the grass or whatever. They're like, oh yeah, you're just connecting with nature. You're just like enjoying the outdoors. But then when you start like trying to talk about the mechanics behind it, that's where it gets a little bit pseudosciency, conspiratorial. And I'm just I have a more open mind, I think, than some. That there's a whole lot of things that we just do not understand about the human condition, well, and about the condition of the universe. And I'm a little bit more willing to delve into that, and I find it fascinating. Like the more I think, like I learn about it, the more I think about it, the less I really think I understand about it.
Isn't that true? there is there's so much that we don't know about how we interact with the earth, with the unseen around us. I get tongue tied about this. I too, one of the things my mom also did for us was make sure we had a lot of that out in nature experiences. It wasn't a deliberate, like, okay, girls, we're going out to do this. It was just part of our lives. It was playing in the woods. It was going and riding our old horse. It was, we had a camp on Lake George in upstate New York, which is a gorgeous lake, and swimming from time I was 18 months old and being out there in that. And we're never taught to recognize what the, for want of a better word, vibration of being in nature and in the elements and of those things does to rejuvenate us and add to our experience level of recognizing those feelings that go along with doing those things. And they're there for a reason. When I look to nature frequently because I think that if I can look at something in nature that I'm confused about in humans, how does that animal interact with that animal? What do they do when they're hurt, or what do they need to eat when they're ill, or whatever? I find a very strong correlation between how would nature handle this
Yeah.
as opposed to why are people doing this
Yeah. Yeah.
as a response to that. But I realize a lot of, most people do not observe these things, and I spend a lot of time observing and looking at what is going on there. How does that work? Why did I just have that experience in that way? And how did that happen? And how did it work? And what was involved with it? And it doesn't, but I have enough information and experience at this point that my ability to think broadly is something that I've learned to do over these decades of exploring different areas of information that may not be what normal people would think to do. And the expanse of what we don't know and what we're taught not to accept is really kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if we were back a few hundred years, I would have already been burned at the stake. I'm pretty sure.
Oh, you?
Yeah, you too. We would both be on the burning pike. But in like I think it makes total sense. Like I don't know. It's like for me, it's just like I can vibe off of somebody who who thinks about those types of things. But I think like I've looked. I think one of the things in your knife craft and expression that really like has popped out to me, and I kind of want to explore this thought process, or at least talk a little bit about it. Is some of your knives, it's specifically the Meltdown series, really, it speaks to me in a way that I just love it. I can't tell you is how infatuated I am with the thing that you've done here, right? But I've thought about this like for many years, and what I love about what you've done, and just kind of, I'll let you explain your thought process, but the way that I interpret it is I've always really loved the Art Deco and Nouveau periods of art because there's something that's happened in that era of artistry where you take something that is an element of nature or just an element, and you break down some of the other noise around it, and you focus just on a nuance or a single line of thought, and then you accentuate that. So the artistic constraint you put on yourself is that I want to focus on something that is stationary but looks like it flows. And in like your Midnight Sunrise or any of these other Meltdown knives that I've seen you make, to me it looks like it has a flow or a movement to it that, even though it's a stationary thing, you could sit on a counter, it looks like it's constantly moving. And I just kind of love that interpretation of what I see in your knives.
Thank you for telling me that, because that really is the essence of what I'm going for. A design needs to have a flow to it, whether it's of a more geometric idea or whether it's a really organic idea like the Meltdowns. I have a very simple design aesthetic, and there's not a big long explanation about it. I design with two things in mind, and that those two things are beauty and magic. And I want those two things in my work. I mean, I feel very strongly about that because I think that you put those things out in the world and it can only be a good thing. And it's having come from an art school background where it's all about the concept and this very wordy dissertation about where your ideas come from that I just absolutely giggle inside over because it's a lot of talk about nothing mostly. Boil it down to just this. This is what I'm doing, beauty and magic. And people feel that. If you can click into the essence of those two things, that's what's happening. And I love the meltdowns. They're difficult to make. There's nothing easy about getting that flowing, effortless look. You know, you want it to look like it just happened that way, and that's not what's going on at all. There's a lot of angst in the process and terror sometimes because you can't control all of it. But I think my most successful pieces, you can feel something about it, and there's, you know, the it factor is what any artist has in the most successful pieces, and that's kind of an indefinable thing, but people recognize it when they look at it. It emits a feeling within them, and I think that's what all artists are striving to create. And you can't do it 100% of the time. I don't know that it's possible to do it 100% of the time.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, like my wife and I have been watching this show called Parks and Rec. And like sometimes like in life, like we have a lot of stuff going on. And so one of our rituals is just to, like, you know, sit down, to veg out, to laugh at something that we find funny or engaging in some way. And Parks and Rec is just kind of like, it's brainless in some ways, but it's also, like, again, esoteric in others, because we kind of talk about concepts and whatnot. And there's this one episode where the main character on here, she spends all this time trying to, like, revive the Parks and Rec team because they're doing budget cuts, and they do this, like, fall festival, and everything has to be, like, on point. They don't have any budget, so they get everybody in the community to donate things, and it's all this, like, it's quite a few episodes of, like, the chaos to get this to a point. And it goes off without a hitch, and then everybody loves it. Then she saves the parks department from being cut out in the budget, because the deal is that we'll do this for free, and we'll do it like very, very low cost. But if it's successful, you know, you keep the parks department around. But if you don't, then you can just wax our entire team as part of the budget constraints. The thing that's interesting about it was not necessarily the episodes leading up into this, like, fall festival and it going well, but the next episode is everybody says, "Oh, that was a really great idea. What's the next one?" Right? And and that episode, she's basically like, I don't have any ideas. Like, I don't have any ideas. And so they go to this little camping retreat, and they try to, like, you know, get everybody to brainstorm ideas, because they think that she has, like, an entire Rolodex of ideas, and she's like blank. She used, like, that was her good idea. And Ron Swanson's character is he says, you know, Leslie, you need to just sleep, like, take a break, like, disconnect from everything, and just give yourself time to rest. And she sleeps, and then she wakes up the next day, and she's, like, writing down ideas. It's like her mind is, like, racing again. Like, she is that thing that everybody thought she was, in the ideas person, and having just, like, a bunch of things that she can spitball. And it's weird because, as you're talking about this like brainless activity of watching television or watching shows and wasting time, I really thought a lot about that as, you don't always culminate the greatest ideas. Like sometimes you're just grasping after stardust, and sometimes you can capture it and you can condense it and put it into the world in a different way. But that also comes with a certain amount of fatigue, and
Yeah.
sometimes you just have to let your base self rest and understand that your next idea is something that happens organically when you kind of calm everything down, like you calm down the vibrations of the last idea and move on to the silence that happens in the interim between idea and idea, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. No, that's very true. And it's not like a on demand thing that happens. It's like, oh, just because I need to come up with a good idea right now doesn't mean it's going to come. And the more pressure I put on myself to have that is likely to push it further away. Um, in my design process, if I sit down to design, if I'm just going to design, it's better to have some parameters than to have no parameters, because the field of ideas is just too big if you don't have some way to corral something to come in, give it a little pathway to go down. But I will, if I'm going to sit down, if I don't have something that just popped in my head that I'm putting down on paper, if I'm just going to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to design something new, I'm going to have an idea to start with. I may have a basic sketch of a profile and just start there. I will generally, though, have an idea that has come into my brain somehow, somewhere, that I just need to put down on paper. In the act of putting it down on paper, and I absolutely cannot design within a computer program. It's too slow for me. I need that pencil on paper and do it fast because I don't do any detail work at that time. It's all about just letting it flow out of me and onto the paper. And the computer is just too slow. Having to use a tool like that, it's just, it breaks up the thoughts too much to be able to allow for where that thing comes out of the ether and that good idea shows itself. So I'll do a bunch of those ideas and I'll do them really fast, really fast. Don't try to develop any of them. Just get them out there, do them over and over again. Just vary them as little or as much as comes through at the time. And after I get a bunch of them down there, then I'll go back and look and see if any of them are worth looking at again. And sometimes there's none that work. And it's not ever a waste of time to have nothing come out. It's just, you got that stuff out. Okay, now you don't have that in there clogging stuff up anymore. You just do it again. Or maybe you go for a walk or you go do something else for a while and then you come back and you try it again. And there's the word that keeps coming to mind is serendipity. There's these serendipitous things that happen during this process where something comes out, just, some way that you use the pencil line that maybe wasn't even part of the deliberate thing you were putting down there might trigger that idea that comes in. And then once you have that basic idea, then you can go back and start playing with how to pull it out in a pleasing way so that the whole overall effect of the piece works from the tip to the tail, to the inside, to the back side, to the front side, top down, everything. And that's the basic process. It's not a rigid thing at all. What which is an entirely different process than making a pattern, which is all about precision.
Yeah. Well, I, I have a lot of thoughts around that. But like in some ways, I think with somebody who has as much knowledge and as much experience in kind of tapping into this thing, I'm interested in always like the juxtaposition between where I'm at and where my guest is at, and where I'm at and where you personally are at. That's why I love this conversation, because I am not a great sketcher. I am not a great drawer. I don't draft things real well. I'm like, I mean, Evelyn's probably just like a better artist than I am when it comes to drawing stuff. Just like, I can't tell you. I just did not spend a lot of time doing it, although I'm very fascinated with it. And so in some ways, I've gone more towards the digital side of augmentation and whatnot, using CAD software or things to build out like two-dimensionality of certain ideas. But I've always felt that as soon as I start to try to cultivate an idea, it dies on the vine, because like you mentioned about not detailing out or developing that idea. It seems like all these like kind of ideas, when you focus too much on one thing and you try to develop it out, then you realize, like, I don't know if I like it. And you spend like 9 million years, it seems, trying to follow a path that doesn't really pan out very well. And
Right.
I've wondered sometimes if I'm just conditioning myself to hate riffing, right? Like, because like that is the idea. Like us talking here, like, man, we're riffing on so many different ideas, and I love this because it's dynamic, and we just so happen to be recording it, right? But we can talk about ideas as they come to fruition, and if for some reason we don't like the content, I can just say, I'm just going to delete this out of the podcast. I don't really know if it has a lot of merit. But it's like, I don't do that everywhere. Like, I'm very regimented in certain areas of my life, and other areas I feel very comfortable. And it's like musicians, when you're going in a jam session, you're just like, you're riffing off of different ideas and themes and whatnot, and you just kind of develop this thing. To me, that's always where I want to exist. But sometimes I don't know if I allow myself to do that so much.
I understand exactly what you're saying, I think. Yes. One of the mistakes, well, what you just said when you said, I'm not a good drawer, I'm not a good sketcher, that is something that I think a lot of people do, and it inhibits the flow of the ideas. And the reason I say that is my sketches are hideous. They are nothing. When I say sketch, I mean, all it is a visual shorthand so my brain can remember that idea. There's nothing pretty about it. I am not in the least trying to make anything that anybody else would recognize. I am just letting it flow out there fast and quick so that when I look at it next time, I'll go, oh yeah, I remember that. And then I can go back and look at it further if it has any merit to do that with it. And I don't worry about what it looks like. I mean, I don't care if anybody ever sees it or not. It doesn't bother me if people want to look at them. But that's the part where I see a lot of people that really do feel that they lack the skill to do it. And I would have to disagree with them, because it's not about the skill of what that thing looks like. All you're doing is putting a visual shorthand down so that your brain can recognize the idea later when you go on and go back and look at it and play with it more. And it's a very free thing. There's no judgment about if that line doesn't look right or anything. And I think if you can approach it from that standpoint, it can be, and that's why I can't do it on the computer, because the ideas are so fast that I can't, with my fingers on the computer, can't go from tool to tool fast enough for it to be a free-flowing process for me. Whereas with a paper and a pencil, I can do that. I mean, I could do it on an iPad too, but I really like that tactility of a pencil on a paper.
Yeah, for sure.
To work from. And again, I mean, maybe that's a grounding thing.
Well, yeah.
That just popped in.
I feel stupid. It's, like certain ideas, like you voice them or whatever, and as like whether you're talking to a person or just speaking them into existence, and then you kind of like you can mull them over. I don't know why I do those things. Like, I mean, limit myself by my self-consciousness, right? And it's not even my, what's crazy about it is I can't say that I'm being self-conscious. The things that keep me from expressing myself are not my own consciousness. It's the perception that other people and their consciousness affects me, right?
Right.
Like you're right. Like, who cares if a line is perfect? Like, nobody might ever see it. Just the same way as they don't know what's going on in my mind. Nobody is there to judge and to validate or to condemn things that I experience or ideas that I have or whatever. And I think that, as we kind of talk about the whole interconnectedness, the internet, social media, the societal like demands of things, I think that it really neuters us because we're way too concerned about everybody else that doesn't give a shit about us, and not enough about the things that we personally can do that make us feel like we are connected and that our ideas and things like that are valid. And that's something that's a personal growth thing that I feel that I need to work on more, because I am constantly neutering myself because of the perception that somebody else needs to care about it, when it really should just be me caring about that thing and exploring it. And that's where I can find my own personal joy and introspection.
That's very profound and very valuable to express that. And I think that's part of I think that's the essence of the human condition, is that we're trying to learn to develop our souls without bringing it down to what other people think about us. I mean, it doesn't even begin to express that concept.
But aren't we nurtured?
That's what came out. Sorry.
No, I mean, it's a good observation though, because aren't we kind of nurtured to do that, right? Like education is an idea that is dumbed down to the lowest common denominator, so everybody understands it, right? Information is that same way. It's like, so we get this idea that people, that like ideas and experience has to be punched down on instead of expecting people to try to punch up. And I feel that a lot. And I'm just like picking up on those vibrations. I think that there's probably a methodology to, when I feel that way, to stop and say, hey, like, am I really punching down or like on my own ideas and my own beliefs and stuff? Or am I trying to get people to elevate to this kind of concept? But it's like when I see kind of like, if I'm perusing stuff on social media or whatever, I see a lot of like derivative ideas. And there's something like that I've noticed. I was talking to Bruce Bump about this, and he was like, I when he was making knives and he was selling it for like, $50 or whatever back in the day, he said that, it was like hunting knives and stuff. And he's like, well, I looked around and everybody else was making hunting knives, and I wanted to do something different, like what, it's boring to be like everybody else. And he started kind of this process of nurturing his own aesthetic and his own ideas. And you have him now at the, latter end of his life, having developed ideas and concepts out that are very clearly his. And there's things that nobody else was willing to touch, like these cut and shoots or dual threat knives that he calls them. They've very seldom been done. And I would say that in our modern era, he had taken that to just a different plane than everybody was used to.
Absolutely.
And I think about that, like, I guess maybe it's like it kind of in that thought, as I talk about those things that like when you have thoughts or you get too deep or esoteric about things, you wonder if you're just looking for complexity in an area where it shouldn't like necessarily exist, right?
Yeah.
Like you're trying to be deep, but does it really need to be deep? And that's kind of the vacillation between, do I think too much about things or do I not think enough about things? And I guess it's the manic nature of self-expression and whatnot that I don't have the life experience and maturity, I guess, to just tell myself to calm down and take a breath. So I'm very neurotic.
There's a fine line. Very fine line sometimes. Yeah. My observation is that everything boiled down is very simple. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it's the simple taking everything down to its basics. It is simple, which is very hard to find a lot of times within your own brain when you're thinking. We want to we've been given so much distraction that makes everything feel complicated in a lot of ways. So we're not used to looking for the simplicity that's there. And it can be paralyzing not if. We all do it, that I can see. You're overthinking and complicating it more than its essence is. It's a difficult thing, and we have to work. We have to work around our own roadblocks and stuff. I mean, just for me to come on your podcast today it's not in my nature to feel comfortable doing this at all. And I would, understanding that this is a good thing to do, and I'm having a blast and I'm enjoying our conversation immensely. And I'm so glad that I've done this. But
well, thank you.
The dread and the anxiety that I have to overcome to do something like this makes me partly understand that, that's why it's good for you to do it, to exercise that part of myself that says, I see that this is a really good thing to do. So I'm going to do it in spite of how I feel.
Yeah. That's why they call it stepping outside of your comfort zone, right?
Exactly. And I have to, I understand that my thoughts control my feelings, not vice versa. That's a hard one piece of knowledge there. And it's not always fun to know that my thoughts control my feelings, not vice versa. Puts a great deal of responsibility
well, yeah,
on yourself once you know that. It's so annoying sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, as I think about that, there's lots of like life anecdotes and things like that people tell you you have to you have to. I've always been told that like the way that you think about things or your mentality or your attitude is what determines like your success or your failure or how you interpret a situation, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that it seems to be like an old anecdote to life where you have to have the right attitude, and that really does change it because like we're as emotional beings and everything, we can get very tied up in like the way that we feel. But if we put it in the right perspective or our perception of things is a little bit different, then we can make lemonade out of lemons, right? Like like all these little like sayings and stuff that tell us, hey, like you're right, like your thoughts do dictate. And I like something that we were like touched on is like how complexity and things like that exist, and if you break down things to very, very simplistic ideas or concepts, that if you can include a few of those in like design principles and knives or any medium that you're choosing, then you can build and riff upon that to make something whole out of individual parts, right?
Yes.
Um, Something that I think about, like when I look at your work, and I know that you and Van had collaborated on that ice and fire folding dagger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like for instance, when I look at that thing, there is so much to it, right? Yet I can trust based on the feeling that it evokes that there is some level of simplicity that it like the thing that I'm looking at is the sum of its parts. And I think that is a little bit different experience than when you get really confused with like simple ideas that are overcomplicated
Mm-hmm.
versus complex ideas that are simplified in order for us to be able to understand it. And I think that that's like our light. Like when I look at something like things like this, I'm reminded that this is emblematical of the human condition, where you're taking a lot of complex ideas and condensing them down into a medium that is tangible, but I can experience it. Like I look at the order of things. I look at the flow of things. I look at um, the different textures. I look at the different light, like jewels and things that refract light differently. I look at all of these things, and it causes me to think more about the complexity in simplicity. It's like, do you look at one galaxy, or do you look at the entire universe of galaxies, or do you zoom in into that galaxy and then find a planet? Do you zoom down even further and look at a single grain of sand on a beach? And those things I think are authentic. They're authentic complexity because you're trying to evoke simplicity and understandability out of complex things versus, again, just being contrary because it's easier to conflagrate complexity out of things that really should be simple.
Yes. Yeah. Um, in terms of designing, if something, the basic is a good design, the basics of it are usually very simple. And then it's the details that are added onto that create a lot of interest, and evoke the feeling of whatever it is that you're trying to say or um, say. And the details need to be deliberate. People sometimes make the mistake of throwing too many things into the idea, and not understanding not really understanding why they're doing it. They just feel like that might be a good idea. But the details, the deliberateness of, like when I do the the dots on the spines of the meltdowns that I do, each one of those is very specifically placed, and the size of each one of those is different. Visually, you'll never know that if you're looking at it just in a picture quickly, because it just doesn't really register. But you would notice it if they were all exactly the same size. Something would seem too rigid about the idea. So it's taking the tiny little detail and making it in itself simple. That adds to the complexity and the feeling of the whole. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And the details are fun. The details are fun. They're like, the simple part is the hard part. Getting that basic simple is the hard part. Then you can go and play with all the other stuff. And even in the play, there is deliberation and all of that, but that's where the real fun part starts.
Yeah. Well, and something that I think about is when I look at your work, I really just it baffles me on how you got to a certain place technically, right? Like some of like the green collage, a part of your Art Deco series.
Yeah, I love that one.
Yeah, it's super rad. But when I look at the lock bar, there's a lot of things that are going on here. But are those emeralds, or what stones are those on the? Okay,
emeralds.
So you have emeralds that are set on the spine of the lock bar, and then you have emeralds that are I don't know what you call that in jewelers' terms, but they're burnished over into those pockets or whatever. I forget what
Cabochons in bezel settings.
Yeah, bezel settings. That's it. Sorry.
Yeah.
So you have like you have them bezel set. You have them set on the spine, and all of that is like to do that one thing. That one thing that or it looks like one thing, but it's really like many things within it. Like it's a technical feat, because I think that to conceptualize that thing is probably a pretty cool thing to do is one thing. To actually articulate that mechanically is a completely different thing, because of how many different elements it has.
Yeah.
Do you think that your experience and your knowledge set inside of like jewelry making and the mechanics of how to do that stuff has influenced some of your decisions on how far you can reach out into like the mechanical side of thing in order to express ideas?
Yes, it had having that additional vocabulary, technical vocabulary, is really just made a huge difference for what I'm able to express. I don't want, like, when I'm designing with the gemstones and stuff, I don't ever add a gemstone just to add more gemstones and add more value in a piece that way. That's not it. Everything has a purpose involved with it in terms of the overall design. You don't notice it so much. You don't notice that they're, how do I want to put this? Hopefully what I'm doing is making the piece so cohesive throughout itself, that you don't say, oh my God, look at all those gemstones. That's not what I want you to do. I don't want people to just focus on that. I love gemstones. They're beautiful. I love that I can add this color that way. I just really love that. But I don't want it to be like, oh, good, look at this giant diamond here, because that's what's important. Because that isn't what's important to me. You know? But having the technical skill to be able to put all those little pieces of color juxtaposed next to like the color of gold or something is just something I'm so happy that I know how to do.
Yeah.
Because it gives me the ability to add this other dimension that is visually interesting, and it's something you just don't. You don't. I think it's also surprising, and I think that's part of the appeal, that people can be like surprised that this is on a knife, and yet it works. It's on a functional tool, but it works. I mean, the design works, and the tool works too. Obviously, that is the bottom line, is it has to function. But having the ability and the understanding of how to set those and do it in an efficient manner is just a joyous experience for me. I like having that skill. And I have to say, I've just noticed this over the last couple of years, that I've been doing this a long time, and I'm finally feeling like I know what I'm doing. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I finally feel confident. I'm not as scared in part of the processes, because some of the stuff that I'm doing is very tricky in terms of, it's very easy to break a stone. It's very easy to scratch this material. It's very easy to melt this gold in a way I don't want it to have happen. And I am finally, and I mean, I've been doing this, let's see, I took my first jewelry class in 1976. I've been doing this a long time, but to finally feel that my skills, I'm at a level where I feel comfortable and fluid and happy with the end result in a way that I haven't done before. And it's, I'm surprised by that, because I thought I was comfortable before, but I wasn't. From this perspective, from this vantage point, I can look back and say that now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 48 years of chasing an idea, right? And I mean,
Yeah.
there's lots of ideas, there's lots of things that you've expressed, but really, if we condense down your life's work into a few basic concepts, right? That idea that you're like evoking like a magical experience and everything really is at the root of all of these things that you've culminated over those 48 years of artistry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think about like when you were mentioning about setting stones and using different embellishments and whatnot, I'm reminded of cooking. Because, when you learn how to cook, you realize that if you put too much salt in something, it's going to ruin the batch. Like
Exactly.
if seasonings should be a thing to accentuate something that is already good by itself.
Exactly.
And
That's a really good analogy. I've never thought of that before, but that's really good.
yeah, well, just riffing, but but you have to know that. I mean, you have to spoil a few batches of soup in order to realize that if you put too much salt in it, you're going to ruin it. But
Yeah.
then, what I'm also interested in is in sophisticated cooking. You have these things that I don't know, like if I think about gumbo, right? Gumbo's this thing that's like, just a pot of a bunch of different things that you mix together and you season it right and it has different textures and whatnot, and it's really appealing. But then you pull in that sassafras root and it provides just a different flavor profile that makes things pop in an even different way. And you can do the same thing with like certain flavors or seasonings and like, like curries and something, or something that is would seem diametrically opposed to what it is that you're doing, but it just somehow works because, I don't know, you know how to use seasonings and you play with it in order to be able to figure out a little dash of this and a little something something as a secret sauce is kind of what makes it work, even though other people just really aren't willing to experience seasoning things.
Right. There's a subtlety that has to be learned, or by experience. You have to do it to have the experience to know what works, and that's a learned thing. And it's the process of learning it is what's so much fun. I love to learn. I love to learn computer programs. I love to learn new technical skills. I love to learn. And that's one thing about learning that I had to figure out. I took a little time to figure out, was that I would get so excited during the initial learning process that I would forget to savor that experience of that happens during that first part of learning, when you're just learning this new technique or this or that. And I would rush through to get to the end because I wanted to see it done. Not because I wanted it over with, just I wanted to see the final product really, really just too much, that I would forget to stop and savor that experience as I was going through it, because you can't get that first part back again. The next parts build on that, but that first part is just magical. And the energy that you get from that excitement and that motivation of, oh, I can't wait to work on this again today because I want to feel how that feels to learn that thing, to know how to do that. And that's such an exciting part of the process. And I like to learn. I love to learn new techniques. I like to learn to figure out a new way to do this thing that I want to accomplish over here. If I have to figure out a new way to fuse this thing or to attach this thing or whatever, I just love that part of the process. There's a vibration to that I just love to feel when that happens.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps going forward, to keep making new ideas, because it's so fun to do that.
Yeah. Well, and different stages of life, right? Because I'm 30, I'll be 37 this year. And, having kids and doing things in life, I've realized that the first 37 years of my life has been squandering it. Because, I'm at a point now in my life where I realize that what I was doing was marginalizing experience and time for the sake of what could come next, right? It's like, everything, like you're, I'm going to be a teenager or I'm going to be a certain age. And you're like, okay, well, I'm almost something else, right?
Right.
And how often do we do that? Somewhat culturally, but I think just as humans, where the thing that is next is new and exciting versus the thing that we're experiencing right now, which is sometimes doldrum. And I've spent a long time, looking for where the stone is going to skip next instead of just enjoying the process of tossing it. And and I think that is a life maturity thing where, 48 years you spent cultivating these ideas and whatnot, and you've been doing it longer than I've been alive, right? and what I think about with that is there was a point in time, growing up and whatnot, that I was not concerned about like anything that I'm concerned about now. Like I don't even recognize like 10-year-old me.
Right.
I don't recognize 18-year-old me. Like my priorities have shifted so much that I don't even identify with that person anymore. And I really, in some ways, I wish I could go back and tell that person to like slow down and absorb more of that experience, because so
Yeah.
much time is spent just rushing through it. And there's a lot of times in Knives where I do the same thing. Like it's the next show, or it's, trying to, like I'm not even considering the process, the artistic process of making a knife. I'm concerned about how I'm cultivating things so that way when I show it to everybody, I can sell it.
Right.
And I'm doing such a disservice to myself to not just
Yeah.
be in the sunlight, just to enjoy the rays of the energy, instead of like, okay, well, let it be somebody else's thing, or let me get a little bit of money for it, or whatever. And I think about that a lot. Like I've taken a little bit of time away from like the hustle and bustle of Knives to really just try to recenter myself and think about why it is that I'm actually doing this stuff. Because I got into knives not because I was ever planning on making money at it, but then somehow it turned into pomp and circumstance and selling them so that way I can support the habit. And I've really become like a analogous to a drug addict in making a knife to sell a knife, so that way I can buy the stuff to make another knife to sell it, and then it's a vicious cycle. Versus me just stepping back and being more mature about it and saying, "Hey, let's slow this down a little bit. Let's Southern draw it. Let's
Yeah.
just enjoy the experience and really try to get as much out of it as we can." And I think that's kind of where I've come to so far in my life, is that I really need to slow down and smell the roses, which is another weird life anecdote that you don't really realize until you're mature enough to realize it. But that like some of the design concepts that we're talking about is actually a larger question mark that I've had around design principles that I've never really been satisfied with, like what answers I've come up with. So I mean, I appreciate you talking about those things, because I definitely think that when I can break those elements down and start with simplicity and basic ideas, understand what I'm trying to evoke with what I'm doing, and then season things according to my experience, or punch up on like learning other things on how to tactically do things,
Yeah.
is very beneficial. But like there's some things that I see out of your work, like I know that Jim Schmidt would do these goblin folders and whatnot, and I've seen some examples from Steve Schwarzer too. But there's an element to that design that is really that it's pure juxtaposition to me. Like, yeah, you have a knife here, but there's something that comes out of taking natural materials and accentuating them in a way that you see something that wasn't there before, or maybe we just didn't see it. It's like
Hmm.
a big Rorschach blot or
Yeah.
whatever. And
Right.
yeah, do you do a lot of the goblin style of folders, or kind of what has been your experience with that kind of medium and working within making them?
I've I've actually only done one at this point, and the one that I did was for a collector who was really good friends with Jim and had picked out um, the handle material, the antler, and before Jim had died, and he came to me and asked if I would. He had little sketch of what Jim's idea was. And he had asked if I would make the knife for him. And it was a big knife, big old antler, huge piece of Damascus for it and everything. And I had not done one before, and I hadn't carved before, hadn't carved any face, anything like that before. And I wanted to do the project because it had been Jim's and I wanted to do that. And I was very good friends with this collector too, and very wonderful person. He and his wife had been my friend for a long time too. And it was a really fun project. I hadn't done anything like that before. I had this small, very rough sketch of the face that was Jim's basic idea. There was not a lot of detail to it, but Larry just gave me this and said, "This is what I'd like you to, this is what Jim had." That's what he said. And then just go do whatever you want with the rest of it. And to be able to work in that way, I just had a great time with it. I think that there's a bit of a limit with those in terms of the fact that, you're because you're working within a pretty specific genre of what is going to come out of it, that it's a little more specific than a lot of the ways that I like to start designing. But it was a really fun process. I enjoyed it. And there's a lot of little details that you can go into in a piece like that that just can be really, really fun. And you can make up a story. You can make up a story that goes along with the way you want it to make it, which is also very fun. I think there's stories that, how do I want to put it? There are tales to be told that add to the overall enjoyment of the piece. And when you get something that is as figurative as that has a personality in the way that it has a personality, and that has a very almost humanoid type of existence related to it, I think that can be a really fun process.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, yeah, like I mean, you're right. Like, I mean, telling the story or the narrative or the fantasy that it evokes is something that I think is very intriguing. For instance, Larry Fugan has produced some of these goblin knives that it boggles my mind of how he actually does it.
Yep.
Because all of those are like, there's no way, to create something the way that he has if you're not thinking in the wavelength that he is.
Right. Exactly.
Some of that stuff has just been like taken to a completely different degree than even Jim had originally done.
Right.
And like I look at some of his stuff because I think the first time I actually, unfortunately, the first time that I had been experienced in Larry's knives like that was when Steve Shackelford released his 50 greatest living knife makers, I think it was, or the greatest living knife makers. And I saw those pictures and I was like, that is insane to me. And, in my mind, I was like coming up with like these stories, like who is this person or this entity that is in this knife? And he really like took that concept of these goblin folders, or I don't even know, like it's just a different genre now, because if you can do these things with creating sculpted pieces like he does, he manipulates them in ways that I just never would have even thought were possible. And so when I saw your goblin knife too, I mean, what a great homage to Jim and y'all's relationship and whatnot for you to be able to produce that.
I was just really honored that I was asked to do that. And I never had done them before because, they were Jim's thing. He really
Yeah.
popularized them. And I just, like I said in the very beginning when I first started, I did not want to ride off of his coattails at all in terms of designs. My designs needed to be specifically different, and they needed to be Dellana's, not Jim Schmidt's. And that was really important to me. So I drew a line. I'm not going to do what he does. So I never did one of those. And I was just really honored to be asked to do that. And I did have fun with it. And I actually have a gorgeous atypical antler sitting down there in the shop waiting for me to want to do another one.
I, there's something I've been fascinated with, and something I guess I didn't really know or think about too much is your relationship with Van, and not only the collaborations that you've done, because there was a long time that I didn't know that you guys were married or partners or whatever. What's that like, having that collaboration between two just like monumental artists and expressionists in this medium? Do you guys like? I mean, obviously, I see the work that you guys can produce when you guys do collaborations and whatnot. But what does that workflow look like from a day-to-day basis and ideating on certain like concepts and whatnot?
Well, it's an interesting process. We were, both established knife makers, successfully so, before we ever met each other. He'd been making knives since high school, and I had been making knives about, I guess 7, 8 years. We met at a knife show and hit it off, and the rest is history, kind of thing. And I was, of course, very adamant again, if I wasn't going to do anything like Jim, I wasn't going to do anything like Van either. Or I was, I, it's very difficult as an artist when you marry another artist, particularly if they also have a name for themselves, that it can kind of diminish each of them if you're not careful. If they get too if they mesh their styles, let's put it that way. And that was not something I was interested in doing. The collaborations that we've done, we don't do an awful lot of them, and it's combining skill sets and ideas during the process. But one or the other of us usually has the basic idea of it, and that's very often is Van comes up with some really spectacular thing, and then we confer about the more detailed parts of it. He's a brilliant mind. He is an artistic genius, and he is also his mechanical abilities to figure out how to do things, and even if he has to invent new ways to do things, he's absolutely brilliant. And I am not always that fun to work with because I don't like to be told what to do and or how to do things. And I mean, he had some suggestions that would have made my life a lot easier if I hadn't waited 17 years to allow myself to think maybe I'll try that kind of thing. So collaboration is an interesting thing on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes it's just like, hey, you go do that. I don't feel like working on that right now.
What's it?
We're two strong personalities, and there has to be a lot of give and take in the process. And I having, I mean, I was single for many years before I got together with him. I was well established in my own design ideas and all of that. So it's a great way to learn and grow, and to learn. I mean, collaborate. It's a great word. It's a great concept where two people can help each other do something. That's a good thing to know how to do, and it's a good thing to. It'll show you where you don't want to do some things that you might be beneficial to learn to override your initial responses to.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's interesting in a lot of ways because, I mean, we that's normalized inside of Hollywood because the nepotism in Hollywood is, you basically marry another actor or actress or whatever, right? And you have your own individual careers, but then somehow mesh together for the sake of marriage and kids and whatever it is that you're doing. But if you think about it, there's really not a lot of partner-based collaboration inside of Knives, or even like marriages between artists. Not like you see in a lot of other industries. It's usually either in different mediums or whatever. I mean, there's very few. I mean, you have Billy Mason-Mole and his wife. You have Buster Wierensky and Julie that were married. You have you and Van. There's just really not a lot of examples there where there was some level of collaboration or working together in some way, but in the same medium-ish. And I've always been interested in like how collaboration and stuff works. Like whose idea was it to in your shop and studio and everything to paint it all white?
Well, to paint it white was Van's idea. I mean, it makes complete sense because you want as much light as possible where you're working. And the older you get, the older your eyes get, the more you understand why that's true. And we had the shop I had before I moved from upstate New York to West Virginia to be with Van. I lived in a little log cabin, and I had one bedroom, and it was a log cabin bedroom, so it's kind of dark and stuff. And I had plenty of lights in there, but you don't realize how much those white walls in like the shop we have now just make it even brighter. And it's such a help to do that. But what I really love is that Van actually is the one that also came up with the idea of painting the large equipment white and put the gold stars on there. I walked out in not this shop, but in the other shop before we moved to this house one day, and he had painted the big bandsaw white and put the gold stars all over it. And I'll tell you what, it is just so happy to walk out there and see a piece of equipment like that and not be that ugly old industrial green. It's just a happy thing to do.
Yeah, well, and like there's one thing in my shop. It's like it's a 2-car garage, and it's like there's wires and stuff. Like it's all very like basic in the sense that it's kind of ugly. It's just like dirty. It's like a shed basically that just has a bunch of tools and stuff in it. And
we've all had those.
Well, yeah, it's like it's totally different than in my head what a dream shop looks like. But
of course,
I've thought about it where sometimes the psychology of things looking like being organized and looking clean or looking orderly or looking a certain way, like there's visual elements to that help with ideas and help with the general juju of you working.
Yep.
And sometimes I just go out there and I'm just like depressed. I'm like, like I have to clean this thing or I have to do this. And it just reminds me of all of my failures and not so much of like, let's just walk out in here and create something new, And so I've tried to slowly migrate my mentality to, okay, I need to go out there and clean, and I need to be more like less of a slob and more regimented about tidying things up. But then I also I'm redoing all of the lights in there. I bought these lights where I'm going to have about 166,000 lumens on the ceilings, so that way I can just like flood the entire garage with light, so that way I can look at things under intense light instead of just always kind of being in the dark and not seeing stuff appropriately. And
It's so important. It makes the world a difference. It takes a lot of the strain out of it and a lot of the stress out of it if you can see what you're doing well. And like you were saying, just to clear the clutter. I mean, it's just so much more pleasant to have a clear place to work.
yeah, I'm reminded of another anecdote. They say like a place for everything, and everything has its place.
Yeah.
And I've been so diametrically opposed to that, because I'm like, no, like you don't get to tell me how many times I take a shower and how like I comb my hair or whatever. It's like I'm just like, no, I can do it, and I can live in chaos. But my thing is like, chaos has its place. I think. I think that we are bombarded by chaos, but it is nice when you want to try to articulate cohesion and peace and ideas, that you do have a place that is clean, that it is orderly, because that's what you're doing. You're taking these little bits and pieces out of the chaos and arranging them in a new way to show what order and creation looks like out of chaos, right? So, but my shop is not there yet. Light is one of those things in organizing, but it's definitely not to the place where I could paint everything white and have a zen garden inside of my shop.
Well, this, our shop now, it was a 2-car garage, cement block walls and everything when we moved in here. And Van, I was there to help, but I did not put this together in my head the way he did. He looked at the space, figured out what we wanted, where we wanted, and how we were going to do it. And the way he works, he builds everything in his head before he touches a thing. He doesn't, and he rarely even does any kind of drawing or anything. So he built the whole thing in his head before he even started the first thing on it. And he solves all the problems that way and everything. I wish I could work that way. I wish my brain did that, but it doesn't. But it's fascinating to see that he actually does that. I mean, he could go to the hardware store without a list because he knows what he's doing and he's already built it. So he just goes and he gets the stuff he needs to build it with. Fascinating way to think. But that's, like I said, my brain doesn't work that way. But back to the chaos thing, I had to finally admit to myself as I got older and wiser, because I used to think I worked well in chaos. That's what I told myself for years and years and years. And my jewelry bench would always be just like a bomb went off, and all the other stuff was always just stuff all over it and everything. And then I finally came to the realization that, well, I don't know that I do work well in chaos because I haven't ever tried not working in chaos. So let's see about that. When we built the shop in St. Albans before we moved here, and it was really nice to have this new shop that was all clean and everything. I'm thinking, oh, look at that. I like working this way better than I like working in chaos. And I started really looking at myself and what my motivations were for saying I like to work in chaos. And it was really boiled down to the very annoying fact that I just really didn't want to clean up. So I left it messy all the time. And I never gave myself the opportunity to see what it was like to work in a really clean, um, non-chaos situation. And I really, nobody, I don't think, enjoys those moments of self awareness where you have to admit those things. But that was it for me. I just didn't want to clean up.
Yeah. Well, I think that's there's a point when people are dying, right? Not to be too morbid, but there's a point where people are dying when clarity becomes the only thing that you have left, right? I see it a lot in people who have cancer or other things that they know that the end is going to be near and they have clarity, right? And the only thing that you can be at that point is honest.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, you can definitely deny it and make it a more painful process, or you can be honest with yourself. And how, like, it's difficult to be honest. It's difficult to just like sit here and to really reflect. And I don't know, like, I don't know if that can happen as organically or as naturally as it could or should if people are just always amped up and tuned into what everybody else is doing. It's kind of like one of those things where um, I really hate technology. Like, I mean, I work in it, I do it, but I'm really at a place where if I could just not be exposed to it at all and just go out and, a few acres of property and really kind of be buffered from it, I think that I would have a lot more peace in the things that are like the system of life at which I am in, right? Like right now, I have
Mm-hmm.
no idea how to navigate this space. Like something's always happening. There's always some drama. There's always something going on online, and I'm bombarded by that constantly. And
Right.
it doesn't really give a lot of opportunities to just sit, to shut up and listen to what is around you. That's the reason why I do like nature so much, because somebody once asked me, like, what do you like about being like out in nature, or what entices you to be an outdoorsman? And the way that I described it was when you are out and you are just existing in a space that is not designed for you, right? You realize how small and insignificant your existence is in the grand scheme of things, but how you are intrinsically connected with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And and most of our lives, I think, are spent buffering us from the reality of existence. We have a regiment that we follow. We make a little nest for ourselves in our home, or in our lives, and the friends we have and everything like that. And it really does kind of remove us from the brutality of nature. And so I've always thought about that as like in accepting ideas, or in at least allowing myself to delve down in the route of Aaron, you're not always right. Like, you might have a bias, but you're not right. And my wife will tell me all the time that I'm not right. So there's no ego here. Like, I just know, like, probably most of the time I'm wrong in some way. And if I don't, I'll talk to her and she'll find it. But um, she like does enable me to think about things and to kind of be a little petulant child of sorts. But then also reminds me that, I'm not, like my poop still stinks, and I'm still not like, she loves me, but she loves me because of my flaws, or in spite of them. And I think that that's a healthy way of looking at things, where, you can come to a level of honesty with yourself, and that's where real growth occurs, because everything is just laid out on the table.
It's it's very freeing when you can come to that point, but it's really hard to get to that point. It's it can be so painful to go through that process. And yet when you can finally accept that, there's a freedom from it that lifts your soul, but it's so hard to do. And
Yeah.
we have so many distractions now, and it's hard to think it's not by design in some ways, that don't think about improving yourself or self growth or um, refining your soul or anything like that. Don't think about that. Think about this over here. Look at your phone. Look at your TV. Look at your laptop. Whatever. And I think that getting out in nature is one of the things that is it sweeps away all of that clutter that happens because of the technology. And I mean, I walk on the road here, and it's all wooded, and there's a few houses along the way and stuff. But I really feel such a strong need to be out there, and particularly if it's real cold or something like that. I really like that feeling, of that physical feeling of, okay, it's a little harsh, but it makes me feel alive, kind of thing, because I am not paying attention to anything but walking and feeling how that feels. And it's a major stress reliever for me. And it's something I've done my whole life, and it's really helpful in gaining some clarity in the midst of what we all live with.
Oh yeah, yeah. And this whole like grounding experience and whatnot. There's been some, with like the paleo diet and everything, where people are talking about like where was the last evolutionary jump in our gut and our experiences, whatnot, and then we have this like technological boom that happens, and we get so wrapped up in what technology and what enlightenment has to offer, I guess, that we forget some of our basic instincts. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a school of thought that in this whole like grounding or earthing, it's basically just being out in nature, like how we've been for as long as humans have existed, and that there's a visceral experience that you get, and like a very basic evolutionary awareness that like when you're out and you are navigating the earth and experiencing nature and the trees and other things, that it uh, it grounds you and your sensory perception and whatnot in a way that we are actually more attuned to than going out and like walking on the street of Manhattan or something.
Oh, absolutely.
And yeah, and I've thought a lot about that, like being able to check out and to zone in on things that are more simplistic. I think is a really interesting intellectual paradigm, because like as you in your medium are talking about making like bringing things down to a simple, understandable concept out of a lot of complexity. I think that one of the reasons why your art form feels good to look at and everything and interact with is because it it draws a parallel with the human condition to what our basic instinct is, if that makes sense. Like what you're trying to do in your medium is the same thing that I think that humans are naturally predisposed to, which is taking complex things or complex systems that we live in and interact in, and bringing them down to a simplistic concept that we can then chew on and metabolize in some way in our own lives.
Yes, I think that's a good observation. Um, because we relate to everything around us because excuse me, whether we are aware of it or not, we're sensing the vibration of it. And I think the attunement, because we are nature, we are part of nature. And I think that there is a um this is gonna this gets out there a little bit, but there's an energy transfer that occurs getting us back in touch with our essence when we're out there. And that's something that the farther away that you get from it, I think the more chaoticness there is in your own head and emotions and things like that. And the harder it is to think clearly. And I think that is almost kind of evident these days.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think that we can agree that like the universe and energy and things like that exist, right? They're fairly constant, I would guess, right?
Oh yeah.
But I think what I feel is kind of profound about that is we exist in this space and we are really just looking glasses. We're basically just lenses that focus things in a different way on different mediums and things like that. So if I think about it that way, there's an awful lot of empowerment because the way that I see life, the way that I see existence, the way that I experience things and manipulate the world around me is magic. Like it is something that is intrinsic to me alone. And I look at things that we have similarities in the way that we see things, but my experiences and my life trajectory augments the way that my objective lens projects things. And like that's I think what's fascinating about it. I mean, not to get too like deep and esoteric. I'm sure that some people like listen to this and they're like, "Oh, just give me some like techniques and ideas about stuff." But I'm like, like those are out there. There's people that like talk about technically how to do things a lot, and I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in like I'm like a perpetual Band-Aid ripper. I really do not feel comfortable if there is too much order and too much like regularity to things. It kind of bores me. So my wife will call me a contrarian. But I do like talking about things that are uncomfortable. I do like talking about things that are out there. And I think that the thing that I personally, I'm very not biased in this, I guess, but when I look at you in relation to like what I would really love to see from you, is some way taking all of this life experience that you've had, because I value it so much, and being able to see it in a medium where I can learn from it technically, right? And I know that you've talked about doing some type of online education system or something like that, but is that on the grand scheme of like kind of where you're going with your own artistry and conveying that to the next generation and other willing participants in your knowledge? Have you thought a lot about jumping off on that and doing some like videos or online education or things of that nature?
Yes, actually, I have thought about that a lot because I think that I have a lot of information that a lot of people would like to have. They might not even know that they don't, because they don't know what they don't know. That I have all these little tips and tricks and stuff like that I've learned over the years, and stuff that would save time and ideas like that. And I really think that I have some information that would be beneficial for people, and that I'm really wanting to do these online classes where self-paced videos, text explanations, all of that, and just lay out what I do and how I do it, including the secret stuff that people don't usually tell you about. I think that there's some valuable information that it's hard to do. It's hard to get it any other way, and I think that I can actually present it with more clarity and more refinement and more detailed information if I do it in a video format where I have time to edit and think it through, and not because I do teach an occasional lockback class up at New England School of Metalwork, and I love doing that, and it's just a great place to teach. And I've had excellent classes, and the students have been fantastic. But you have a finite number of days, and it's so much information to get across when people are trying to follow what you're doing, do those things, and there are inevitable mistakes that happen in the because the time is so limited. There's details that I can't possibly get into at that time, even if I remembered to do that, just time wise. And I think that a really well thought out self-paced class might be the best way to present the information.
Yeah. Well, I will be one of your first students. I mean, I'd be more than happy to pay for that kind of knowledge, right? And to be able to have the perspective, because like they say, like a lot of people have really good advice that's, go and learn from somebody. Like if you're getting into knives and whatnot, like take a few classes and try to feel out whether that's something that you actually want to get into. But there's a pretty large disparity between those who are just getting into a craft, where I think that the knowledge is pretty well established, right? Not the tips and tricks, like sophisticated tips and tricks, but like a baseline. And then there's, for the rest of us that are trying to push into a different echelon or a different way of thinking about things, there's not a lot. Like Bob Trezzola is going to be launching his online education stuff. Kyle Royer has been doing one. There's a few that are like Jason Knight is another one, but there's not a lot of people like makers out there that will sacrifice their own creative process in doing what they have done in order to be able to try to encapsulate that knowledge and present it back to people like me who like need need/want an inspiration kick to be able to think differently or outside of the box about things. And as lazy as it is for me to say, I'd much rather just I'd much rather watch somebody and understand what they're doing in order to kind of sculpt how I want to do things. I still think it's very beneficial, because if people can't talk to you and people can't experience Dellana and all of the magic that you're producing, that's one thing that will be lost to the ether when you're no longer here. And I think that videos and getting more experience with you on online and on that medium is something that I don't know what the impact will be exactly, but I know that there's a lot of people that need it. And I don't know that there's a better example of an artist that I could think of to present it in the way that I think that you can present it. So I strongly encourage it.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Aaron. It's hard to know if anybody would really want it or anything like that when you're inside yourself thinking about doing it. I really appreciate your encouragement on it, because I do think there's some value there. And basically, the way I look at it is, it's teaching another language, because I talk about this sometimes about, I have this vocabulary, I have this jewelry vocabulary, and I have this whole language in my head and all these things that I can draw on because I know that language that I didn't have before I learned how to do those things. And I think it's teaching that language, that another language. And I'm not talking about teaching jewelry stuff. I'm talking about teaching knife stuff, that is so, to see it from a different perspective, and it can and point out the things that are important to know and that are helpful to know. I think that could be of value, and I'm looking forward to doing it.
Yeah, well, it's you can be the Rosetta Stones for the knives versus jewelry and these creative mediums that mesh. Like, there's a lot of really great aspects of learning jewelry and precious metalworking and stone setting, and then also how knives in that medium kind of intersect. And that's what we need more of, is the Rosetta Stones to help us to cross-translate those things. To me, that's a very powerful thing to do.
Yeah, I think so too. And what I learned by making jewelry first really helped me so much, because there's techniques from that I brought over into this were just so helpful, that people that were just knife makers had never heard of before, and it just was so helpful to be able to have those skills, and I would like to pass those on to people too.
Yeah.
But I think that it's an exciting thing to do. I'm interested in video editing and making and all that stuff, so that'll be a fun new thing to do.
Well, yeah. I mean, you're a bag of tricks that I'm constantly interested to see what you're going to be pulling out, and it's kind of weird, in podcasts where you think, like, you feel like you could talk to somebody for a long time and stretch them out to figure out what a good transition point is in, like, stopping them. But, like, I know that you have to get back to life and other things that you're doing, and I appreciate that you've invested so much time in speaking just about you and the universe and things like that. But I don't. There's a portion of this episode that I'll feel sad about it ending, because I know that we'll go on our own paths and experience our own things and whatnot. But I want to make sure that's not understated how much I appreciate you, how much I appreciate what you are doing for the industry, and taking this time to talk with me, and to also let listeners be a fly on the wall, because these are the things that really kind of keep me engaged in this medium of podcasting and growing in it, because you're like a candle in a really dark room that provides a light that keeps us kind of wanting to venture and figure out how large that room is. And it does not go unnoticed or unappreciated by me, of just how much other things you could be doing in a 2 almost 3 hour conversation with me. You could be doing other stuff. So I mean, I appreciate your energy, and I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for saying all that. And I have to say, I really appreciate that you asked me. And I really had thought, well, okay, we'll do this about an hour and that'll be it. And that's good. That's a nice amount of time. But I have thoroughly enjoyed doing this with you and our conversation. And I like where you took it and how much fun you have made this be for me too. You have a real talent for this, and I really enjoy you. And I would like to have more conversations too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, and I it's my show. I get to do what I want, right? So anytime you want to come back on and we can talk about different things and be more focused towards different concepts, I love that kind of stuff. So I mean, we can. It doesn't have to be a 4-hour conversation on esotericism. We could talk about other things too. So, anytime that you want to come back on and we want to talk about things, let's talk about different ideas and whatnot, and then we can just get on the podcast and riff about them. And I think that'd be really great.
That sounds like fun. I thank you so much, Aaron. I really have enjoyed this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure entirely.
I have I have really enjoyed your mind and your questions and your responses and your thoughts about what we've talked about here. Um, it's it it's been very fun and enjoyable for me.
Yeah, well, that's a high praise coming from you, and I, I just appreciate you. I really admire you. So, kind of with that all being said, I know you need to get back to it.
Okay.
And I will edit this up, but I can't think of almost a single thing other than a little blip of like internet connectivity stuff that we have to edit out. But other than that, it's it's just been a real pleasure riffing with you. So thank you
Thanks.
for being on the show.
It has been a real pleasure. I very much appreciate you asking me.
Yeah, thank you. And is this your first podcast? I think that we talked about that earlier a little bit, but I know that you've done interviews, but first podcast?
Yes, first podcast.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure being the first podcast experience that you've had. I hope that there's many more that you get invited on because I know that you got a lot of stuff that you can say. I just hope that people invite you on to pick your brain and get more of Dellana out into the podcast sphere.
Thank you.
All right. Well, you have a good one, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, you too, Aaron. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.